My dad screamed, "You do nothing for this family. Get out." So I grabbed my keys and left. 8 days later, my sister reached out panicking. "Why is the power off?" I just messaged, "Thought I did nothing." Then came the voicemail. I, 32M, never thought 8 words would change everything. But there I was, standing in our family kitchen last Tuesday evening, listening to my father scream at me to get out because I supposedly did nothing for this family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd just finished paying the monthly utilities, electric, gas, water, internet, like I had for the past 3 years since moving back home after my divorce. My laptop was still open on the kitchen counter, showing the confirmation screens for each payment. Dad had walked in right as I was closing the browser tabs. The argument started over something stupid. Mom had mentioned needing groceries, and I'd offered to pick them up after work tomorrow. Dad overheard and launched into his usual tirade about how I was always making promises I wouldn't keep, how I lived in his house rent-free and contributed nothing, how at 32 I should have my life together instead of being a burden. I tried explaining about the bills I covered, the yard work I did every weekend, the times I drove Mom to her doctor appointments when he was too busy. But he was already worked up, face red, veins bulging in his neck. He told me I was making excuses, that paying a few bills didn't make up for being a disappointment, that I was just like my ex-wife had said, unreliable and useless. That last part hit different. My ex-wife's words coming from my own father's mouth felt like a physical blow. Before I could process it fully, he was shouting those 8 words that would stick with me. "You do nothing for this family. Get out." So I did exactly what he asked. I grabbed my keys from the counter, walked upstairs, threw some clothes and essentials into a duffel bag, and left. No dramatic speech, no slamming doors. Just quiet compliance with his demand. I drove to my buddy Mike's place across town. He was surprised to see me with a bag at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, but didn't ask too many questions when I explained I needed a couch for a few days. Mike's been my friend since college. He knew about my dad's temper and my complicated family situation. The first few days were actually peaceful. I went to work, came back to Mike's, helped him with some projects around his house, and tried not to think about home. I didn't call or text anyone from my family. Dad wanted me gone, so I stayed gone. But I also didn't set up any automatic payments for next month's bills. Wednesday came and went. Then Thursday. By Friday, I was settling into a routine at Mike's place. He'd even suggested I could stay longer if needed. His girlfriend was out of town for work, and he appreciated the company and help with household stuff. Saturday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from my sister. 17. I knew something was up because she normally barely texted me unless she needed something. The first message was confused. "Hey, where are you? Dad's acting weird about you not being home." The second was more urgent. "Mom's asking if you're okay. Can you call?" By the 17th message, sent at 6 in the morning, she was panicking. "Why's the power off? The internet's down too. What's going on?" I stared at my phone for a long moment, then typed back the exact words that would become the centerpiece of this whole mess. "Thought I did nothing." My phone started buzzing immediately with calls from her number, but I was already feeling a satisfaction I hadn't expected. For 3 years, I'd been the invisible support system keeping their lives running smoothly, and Dad had convinced himself, and apparently everyone else, that I contributed nothing. Now they were finding out exactly what my nothing looked like. I spent Saturday helping Mike reorganize his garage, trying not to think about my family dealing with no electricity, no internet, no hot water. But every time I remembered Dad's words about being useless, the guilt faded a little more. Sunday brought more frantic messages from my sister. She'd figured out that the utilities were in my name, not Dad's. Apparently, when I'd moved back home 3 years ago and found out Dad was behind on several bills, I'd quietly transferred everything to my name and started handling the payments to protect Mom's credit. Dad never asked how the bills got caught up. He just enjoyed not having to worry about them anymore. My sister's messages progressed from panic to anger to pleading throughout the day. She explained that Dad had been calling utility companies trying to get service restored, only to be told he wasn't an authorized account holder. The companies wouldn't even talk to him about accounts that weren't in his name. She begged me to call and fix it. Said Mom was crying, that Dad was furious but also scared, that neighbors were starting to ask questions about why our house looked empty and dark. I turned off my phone and spent Sunday evening watching Netflix at Mike's, comfortable in his warm, well-lit living room. Monday at work was surreal. I kept expecting to feel guilty or worried, but instead I felt lighter than I had in months. My coworkers commented that I seemed more relaxed. For the first time in years, I wasn't stressing about getting home to handle some crisis or chore that Dad would later dismiss as meaningless. Tuesday brought a different approach from my family. Mom had gotten my work number somehow and called during my lunch break. Her voice was small and confused when she asked why I'd left, why the power was off, when I was coming home. I explained what Dad had said, how he'd ordered me out, how he'd made it clear I was unwelcome. Mom went quiet for a long moment, then said she didn't know about any of that Dad had told her I'd just decided to leave without explanation. She asked about the bills, and I told her honestly that when Dad said I did nothing for the family, I figured that included the utilities I'd been paying. Mom started crying then, saying she hadn't known I was covering all of that Dad had told her the bills were handled automatically. That conversation should have made me feel worse, but it actually strengthened my resolve. Even Mom hadn't known what I was contributing. Dad had been taking credit for my work for years, letting everyone think he had everything handled while I quietly kept the lights on. Wednesday brought the first sign that Dad's anger was turning into something else. My sister called my work line this time, and her tone was different, less demanding, more desperate. She told me Dad had spent the previous day trying to get utilities connected in his name, only to discover that his credit score had taken hits from those old delinquent accounts. The utility companies wanted security deposits he couldn't afford for immediate connection. She explained that Dad had been telling neighbors that there was an electrical problem being fixed, but people were starting to figure out the truth. Someone had apparently made a comment about seeing our family loading up on ice and batteries at the grocery store. I listened to all of this with growing amazement. Dad had always been so concerned with appearances, so worried about what people thought of our family. Now his pride was costing him in the most visible way possible. Thursday evening, exactly 1 week since I'd left, Mike and I were grilling burgers in his backyard when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Dad. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Quiet, almost deflated. He asked where I was, if I was safe, when I might be coming home. No demands, no accusations, just questions that sounded like they came from someone who was scared. I told him I was staying with a friend, that I was fine, that I'd left because he'd told me to. There was a long pause before he said he'd been angry when he said those things, that he hadn't meant I should leave permanently. I asked him about the utilities, about whether he still thought I did nothing for the family. Another long pause. Then he admitted he hadn't realized I was handling all of that he'd assumed the bills were just automatically paid somehow. For 3 years, I'd been paying roughly $1,200 a month to keep their house running. Electric, gas, water, sewer, trash, internet. Even the lawn service that kept Dad from having to mow in the summer heat. I'd never asked for acknowledgement or thanks, just quietly handled it because it needed to be done. Dad's voice got smaller when he asked what it would take for me to come home and turn the utilities back on. I told him I'd think about it, and hung up. Friday brought desperation. My sister texted that Dad had swallowed his pride and tried to borrow money from his brother for the utility deposits, only to be told that Uncle Jim was tired of Dad's financial drama and wouldn't help. Apparently, there had been other borrowed money over the years that Dad had never mentioned to us kids. She said Mom was staying at a friend's house now because the house was too cold without heat, and Dad was sleeping in his car some nights rather than admit to anyone else what was happening. I realized I held all the cards now, and it was a strange feeling. For years, I've been the family member everyone could count on, but no one really noticed. Now I was the only one who could fix their crisis. Saturday morning, I drove back to the house for the first time in 8 days. Dad's car was in the driveway, but the house looked abandoned. Newspapers piling up, mail overflowing from the box. That empty feeling houses get when no one's really living in them. Dad answered the door looking older than I'd ever seen him. A week of cold showers and sleeping poorly had taken a visible toll. He invited me in with a politeness that felt foreign coming from him. We sat in the cold living room, and he did something I'd never experienced before. He apologized. Not a casual sorry, but a real acknowledgement of what he'd said and how wrong he'd been. He admitted he'd gotten comfortable with me handling things, and had somehow convinced himself that made me lazy rather than helpful. He asked what I needed to hear from him, what it would take to fix this. I told him I needed him to acknowledge, in front of Mom and my sister, exactly what I'd been contributing to the household. I needed him to understand that calling me useless when I was single-handedly keeping the family infrastructure running was not just wrong but cruel. Dad agreed immediately, which surprised me. I expected more resistance, more negotiation. But a week of consequences had apparently been very educational. I used my phone to call the utility companies right there in front of him, getting reconnection scheduled for that afternoon. The satisfaction of watching relief flood his face was better than any apology could have been. Mom came home that evening, and Dad kept his word. In front of both her and my sister, he explained exactly how much I'd been contributing financially and practically, how he'd been wrong to dismiss my efforts, how the family had been relying on me more than anyone had realized. My sister looked stunned. Mom cried again, but this time from embarrassment that she hadn't known. Dad looked exhausted but determined to make things right. Update 1. 3 weeks after I moved back home, Dad had what I can only describe as a complete personality change regarding household responsibilities. He started a spreadsheet tracking who contributed what to family expenses. He insisted on splitting the utility costs 3 ways between him, Mom, and me. He even started doing his own grocery shopping instead of expecting Mom to handle everything. My sister, who hadn't been living at home but had been benefiting from family dinners and laundry help during her weekend visits, suddenly found herself asked to contribute too. Dad told her that if she wanted to keep treating our house like her personal hotel and restaurant, she needed to help with costs. The change was so dramatic that I wondered if the whole crisis had been some kind of wake-up call about more than just my contributions. Dad started talking about retirement planning and seemed worried about finances in a way he'd never expressed before. But the most surprising development came a month after the power incident. Dad called a family meeting and announced he'd been seeing a counselor about his anger issues. He said the week without utilities had forced him to think about how he treated people, especially me, and he didn't like what he'd discovered about himself. He apologized again, more thoroughly this time, and asked if I'd be willing to go to a few sessions with him to work on our communication. I agreed, mostly because I could see he was genuinely trying to change. Update 2. 6 months later, our family dynamic had completely transformed. Dad and I went to counseling together for 2 months, and it helped both of us understand patterns that had been building for years. Dad had been feeling overwhelmed by financial responsibilities and had somehow made himself believe that everyone else in the family was taking advantage of him, when the reality was the opposite. The counselor helped him see that his need to maintain control and appear capable had blinded him to the contributions others were making. For my part, I learned that my tendency to quietly handle problems without communicating about them had enabled Dad's misconceptions. We developed new systems for handling household responsibilities and finances. Everything became transparent: who paid for what, who did which chores, what the family budget looked like. It removed all the assumptions and resentments that had been building up. My sister ended up moving back home temporarily to save money for a house down payment, and she fit right into the new system. She took over lawn care and some of the utility costs in exchange for room and board. Mom started handling more of the household management that Dad had been stressing about. The most unexpected outcome was that Dad became proud of my financial management skills instead of resentful of them. He started asking for advice about investments and retirement planning. Our relationship became collaborative instead of antagonistic. Update 3. A year after the power incident, I got a promotion at work that came with a significant raise. Instead of immediately moving out like I'd originally planned, I decided to stay home another year and help my parents get ahead on their mortgage payments. But this time, it was a conscious choice made by adults who respected each other, not an obligation filled with resentment. Dad's anger issues didn't disappear overnight, but he developed tools for managing them and never again dismissed someone's contributions without understanding what they were actually doing. He became the kind of father I'd always wished for: supportive, appreciative, and emotionally available. The house that had felt tense and unwelcoming for so long became a place I actually enjoyed being. Family dinners turned into genuine conversations instead of criticism sessions. Mom relaxed in ways I hadn't seen since I was a child, no longer walking on eggshells around Dad's moods. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't left that night, if I'd stayed and tried to argue or defend myself. Would Dad ever have learned what I was actually contributing? Would our family have ever addressed the dysfunction that had been poisoning our relationships? 8 days without electricity taught my family more about my value than 3 years of quiet contribution ever had. Sometimes people need to experience the absence of something before they can appreciate its presence. The voicemail I mentioned at the beginning? It came on day 9, after the power was back on, but before I'd fully committed to coming home. Dad's voice was shaky as he left a message saying he'd found the folder where I kept records of all the household bills and payments. He said he'd spent an hour going through 3 years of documentation, adding up everything I'd contributed, and he was calling to say he finally understood exactly what nothing looked like. He said he was proud to have a son who cared enough about his family to quietly keep them safe and comfortable, even when that care went unrecognized. He said he hoped I'd come home not because they needed me to pay bills, but because they loved me and wanted me there. That voicemail is still saved on my phone. Sometimes, when I'm having a tough day, I listen to it to remember that people can change, that standing up for yourself sometimes teaches others how to treat you, and that family relationships don't have to stay broken just because they've always been difficult. The best revenge wasn't making them suffer. It was showing them who they'd really been pushing away and giving them the chance to do better.